Hello, everyone. My name is John Mumm. I'm a water planner under the Interstate Stream Commission of New Mexico. Today, we're going to be giving an in-depth presentation. We're going to let people to hop on in the next few minutes, and then we'll get going. Hello, everyone. My name is John Mumm. I'm a water planner with Interstate Stream Commission of New Mexico. Today's presentation is an in-depth resilience assessment discussion that we'll be talking about the evaluating of resilience for irrigated cultural water systems to climate change. Our presenter today is Amy C. Lewis of Hydroanalytics. She's a hydrologist and water planner that has been helping the state, cities, and tribes and pueblos throughout the state with water planning and hydrology for years. And I'm really excited to have her give a presentation on what we've been doing with evaluating the resilience of irrigated agriculture. So I'm going to let Amy start her presentation, and thanks for everybody for attending.
Thank you so much, John. And I'm so happy you guys are joining in to help us think about this. So we're working on a 50-year water plan, and hopefully many of you are aware of that. The 50-year water plan has 3 pillars of that Michelle Lujan Grisham wanted it to be included: stewardship, sustainability, and equity. So for stewardship, we're engaging scientists and collaborating with other agencies as we work to understand the impacts of climate change on New Mexico's future water resources. And for sustainability, then we're examining the aspects that increase our resilience to climate change and support the future. That's a big part of what we're doing here. And then for equity, we want to help prioritize funding for those that are most struggling. And a summary of the climate panel's work and the report that just came out and is available for review is that we can expect decreased runoff and recharge due to the increased aridity. And it could be like on the order of 25% over the next 50 years. We can expect decreased snowpack and earlier runoff, greater demands on groundwater and surface water, increased hotter droughts, and more stress on vegetation, and then increased forest fires. This is not a pretty picture. Flooding and sediment transport, irreversible damage to soils, and degraded quality of water. So climate change affects so many aspects of our world. And what we're talking about here today is the impact on a big water user in the state, agriculture and livestock watering. Watersheds and habitat will be talked about next week, as well as recreation and quality of life. And then public water systems will be talked about on Thursday in depth. And John's going to talk about it, an overview of it tomorrow. So what can we do to prepare for climate change? Well, what we can do is increase our resilience. And resilience is the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions and respond to, and recover rapidly from disruptions. And so why are we examining resilience? Well, I guess I'm kind of repeating myself here. We want to identify the most vulnerable irrigated agricultural water systems and help water systems operators consider how to prepare for the climate change that's coming their way, and identify actions that they can to improve their resilience. So we want your feedback on the best process for reaching out to folks and for how we do the assessment. And so we've identified the projected climate shocks that might impact agriculture. We're determining which factors impact the ability to adapt to these climate shocks. So how do we measure the ability of an irrigated agricultural system to respond, and what data are available for this assessment, and which factors are most important? So we want your feedback on these questions. And just in summary, this is what the OSC estimated for water use in 2015, and water use, I mean diversion, not consumption. So 76% for agriculture, 9% for public water systems. Together, that's 85% of the water use. So we've kind of focused our analysis on these largest water use sectors. And this is a map of the water use the irrigated locales that the OSC has been tracking water use since 1965. So the areas in yellow are the areas that have irrigated agriculture. You can see some of them the areas are quite a bit bigger than the actual place where irrigation is occurring, and that's the green areas. So we are using that the OSC's areas and their information about each of these areas to look at the resilience. They use the modified Blaney-Criddle method, except in the San Juan Basin, I believe, to figure out how much water is diverted in each region. And we know how much comes from surface water and groundwater and what type of crops they use. So that's the basis for this analysis. And when we think about what increases our resilience, no matter what the system, whether it's a public water system or agriculture, these are some of the big categories. One is the water supply diversity, and whether it's a mix of surface water and groundwater, whether there's a sufficient supply, if it's a shallow aquifer versus a very thick aquifer, or a low stream flow versus high stream flow, makes a difference. We're looking at the infrastructure capacity, the health of the watershed from whence the water comes, and then the ability to manage the demand. So I'm going to talk about these pieces that we looked at. So the first one is the diversity of water supply. And so we've learned that if we've got a conjunctive use strategy, we can use the renewable supplies when they're available, and then rest the aquifer when it's a wet year. And then when it's a dry year, the groundwater is recovered and available for use. So that's the theory. If the drought goes on for too long, then we don't get to use this renewable supply. But that's the idea. So this map shows the percent of surface water in the magenta color up in basically the northern part of the state. And then those that are pretty much 100% on groundwater are in the blue color, and then the purple and it has a good mix of resources, surface and groundwater. Next, for the water availability, we looked at surface water availability and then groundwater availability. For surface water availability, we looked at the minimum flow ever recorded on each of these stream gauges for their period of record and of at least 10 years. Some of them have over 100 years of record. And then we compared that to the demand over the 6-month period of irrigation and then calculated a ratio. So if it's all groundwater, there's the ratio 0. So this is just scoring surface water. And you can see that most of them, the surface water supply is pretty minimal, like a 1-to-1 ratio in a dry year or less. So in some areas, it's slightly more than 1. So that's just one indicator of how vulnerable you are. Then for the stream, groundwater, we looked at whether they're stream connected. Ideally, it would be great to have a good map of the state with the saturated thickness of the aquifer, and we could assess it more carefully. Here, we looked at the areas that are stream connected based on, ISC compacts and keeping the river whole versus those that are in isolated closed basins where the aquifer is in a mined condition, meaning the water levels on continually declining and not getting replenished fast enough. There's also a few areas in stream connected aquifers that there's not much groundwater to begin with. So it's pretty minimal or less resilient. So then we looked at infrastructure capacity, and that's the ability to store runoff. So one of the predictions of climate change is that there'll be more, our runoff will occur earlier, maybe 3 weeks earlier. And those systems that have a reservoir to capture that runoff are more resilient than if they don't to this particular factor. So this is a map that compares the amount of storage capacity versus what they're diverting. So if their diversion is less than, so groundwater is 0 because there's no storage capacity for this surface water criteria. In other cases, it's between 1 to 5, so up in northern New Mexico. And then down in Elephant Butte has a very large reservoir, but they also divert quite a bit. So the ratio is between 16 to 20. That's how this criteria works. And then we also looked at the erosion risk. So irrigated agriculture utilizes surface water originating from vegetated watersheds are at risk for post-fire debris flows, but they're also at risk for just erosion. And this map is not, this is the erosivity risk and not the post-fire debris flow map. And so we can look at the areas and how vulnerable they are to this erosion. But we looked at the HUC 12, the average risk for HUC 12 watersheds, and then came out with this map that shows between slight, like in eastern New Mexico, there's very little risk of erosion compared to the areas around the mountains. And this erosivity map is from the State Forest Action Plan. And it helps characterize those areas that are vulnerable to erosion based on the K factor and slope and aspect. So another piece is the demand management, that whether you have sharing agreements or in your ability to respond to change your demand in response to drought. So in order to look at the demand management, this is a work in progress. because climate change is projections include longer and more frequent droughts, we really need to be prepared for those. And communities that have sharing agreements are much more resilient. They're ready to deal with the shock of a drought. This is nothing new to New Mexicans. And so many places already have sharing agreements in place. And those are even just an irrigation district that's already set up. You already know how to manage a drought and how to share it. And some actually have shortage sharing agreements. And they didn't, some of those like the Rio Hondo that didn't, or the Guayanus, they don't quite fit into these irrigated agricultural areas, that the locales that are mapped by OSC, they're smaller than some of those. So within these, there may be sharing agreements. And then if they're adjudicated, you can share a baseline priority date. There's also the AWRM, the active water resource management areas, where shortage sharing can occur. I need to work on that more and find out if all of those areas have sharing agreements. And then the last piece is the ability of a farm to adapt to a shortage in one particular year. So this is one possible way to look at it. We looked at the percent of permanent crops within the farmed area. If they've got in red at 76% or 51 to 76% permanent crop, whereas the darker blue is pretty much all no permanent crops, as in orchards and vineyards that would die if they are not watered that year. They can't just like water them one year and not the next. Whereas if it's another type of crop that's annual, then you can decide to plant fewer acres or do some sort of 1 year sharing agreement where you lease your water rights back to someone else and don't farm that year. It's not as devastating if you had a permanent crop. So if we wanted to score all of these factors and give them a particular weight, we could add up the overall resilience. But we're not going to do that today. I'm just going to show you how they score based on these each of these pieces. So the water diversity score, those that are 100% surface water or all groundwater get a low score. Those with a diverse portfolio get a higher score from 1 to 5. And if we look at the surface water ratio, most have a pretty low ratio and are very vulnerable to drought. That's nothing new. Most are not, well, the Pecos Basin and the Rio Grande are in stream-connected aquifers, and these other areas are in mined aquifers, or not, where there's not much groundwater use at all. The infrastructure capacity then this is again based on the ratio of storage, or the ratio of surface water storage to surface water diversion. And it's a mixed bag across the state. And then the erosion risk score from red, these are the most vulnerable irrigated areas in red, and then less vulnerable is in blue. And then the sharing agreements, these are the areas they get a high score if they've got a sharing agreement, middle score for AWRM, and then with no agreement, it's mapped as red. And then the cropping pattern, they get a lower score. There's this one area that had 76%, and then these are 50%, and then all the rest of the area is in most, good chunk is all annual crops. So that is the end of my presentation. I probably went too fast, but I think we could go back and look at this chart and see whether there's some aspect that's missing or something that should be weighted differently. And I worked to balance the scores based on whether they had only groundwater or only surface water, so that one farm area wouldn't be weighted too highly, or well, I'm not showing you the total scores anyway. So I will turn it back to John and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or submit it through the questionnaire, which should be at the top of your screen. And Amy and Hannah, make sure that you guys hit the unmute all piece so people can easily just jump on for discussion. If you have anything that you want to verbally say, feel free to unmute yourselves and so we can discuss this. I do have one question. It seems like a lot of rangelands are mapped as annual in the cropping pattern map. Can you explain? Feel free to back up to that, Amy, if you want. Right. Yeah.
So this is that was the right one, sorry. Okay. They're not growing vineyards, or they don't have orchards. Mm-hmm. That would be why.
Do you think it might be the percentage amount within those large areas of why too?
It could be. And then also, it doesn't mean that entire area is cropped. As I said, I'm sorry to jump back to this map here. Can you see the green areas? That shows what the USDA estimates as cropped areas. So some of the places are huge areas, but there's only just a little bit of irrigation right by the stream. But that's the area for which we had data.
Thank you, Amy. Amy, Hannah, can you make sure that you guys hit the unmute all participants? So if they want to jump on the discussion piece, it should be under the attendees drop down to make sure that they can unmute themselves. Oh, okay, there we go. Hello. Hello. Okay. Is there any questions or input that anybody has on this these in-depth maps, or anything that they were wondering for questions on it, or wanted to discuss?
And also, maybe I'll jump in, John, this is Hannah. We're really looking for feedback from you all about what's missing here. Does this make sense to you? Are there considerations that haven't been included, and your recommendations for how to do so? So thanks everybody for your time and attention today. It looks like there's a question from Paula. You should be able to unmute yourself, Paula, and speak up.
Okay, got it. A lot of information to take in, so I really want to ask more informed questions, but my immediate reaction is just to thank you for pulling all of this information together. I love maps, and it's really interesting to see things graphically, so thanks for doing that. I guess my first question has to do with defining resiliency in terms of that you talked about conjunctive management, and I think you know, there's been some interesting work by NMSU on how acequias or just irrigated agriculture generally contributes to aquifer recharge. And I think just in terms of the overall system, if you weren't really separating things by sectors, you know, the presence of acequias generally in a watershed improves resiliency of the overall system. And I'm just wondering how that will be captured in an assessment, resiliency assessment that is probably like more of a cross-sector look, because it, of course, you know, aquifer recharge from acequias will help the river and it'll help all the other neighboring irrigators. So, you know, you could look at it within the sector or cross-sector, but it also, you know, by recharging aquifers, it helps for resiliency of, for example, community water systems. So I just want to see what your thoughts are on how to capture that. That's one question. And kind of a parallel opposite question, or the flip side of that same coin, is how are we accounting for the impacts of how does groundwater depletion affect the resiliency of irrigated agriculture? And you know, obviously there are places where aquifers are have been depleted far more than in others, and in a lot of the acequia areas, there's less groundwater pumping for agriculture, and we're mostly reliant on surface. So we're vulnerable by being overly dependent on surface water. But you know, I would also think that places that are running out of groundwater are probably vulnerable as well. And also, you know, thinking about if for some reason surface users started to switch to supplemental wells because they thought that was going to make them more resilient and less vulnerable to surface water, maybe that's resiliency in the short term, but over the long term, that's less resilient. You know, and so these are just really dynamic systems, and it's like trying to grab a handful of water. You know, like how do you define resiliency? I think it's complicated, and I just wonder if there's like sidebars or footnotes to some of these bigger categories and concepts that talk about that intersectionality.
Thank you, Paula. To answer your last question, this area in eastern New Mexico is very vulnerable, and you probably know the aquifer in some area has 5 years left, and most of when we look at the models, that it's going to be dry. All this agriculture that occurs in eastern New Mexico will have to go to dryland farming. The aquifer will not be there to sustain it. So that's yeah, all this area, all this ag is going to be gone. So unless there's some plan to pipe in water from somewhere else, they don't have any options to improve their resilience. So I hope that answers that question. With acequias and their systems recharging the aquifers, in a way, maybe it gets captured for the under the public water systems. So we have the same map for public water systems. If they're stream connected, they get a higher score. And most places where there's an acequia, it's a stream connected system. Aside from having a model of the entire state, you know, where we could really assess things in detail, this is what we're using for that aspect.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I think Hannah and I can kind of touch on kind of how the main goal of the assessment piece, how things can interact, because overall water resources work as an entire system. But the reason we broke things down into sector is to allow for people of expertise within the sectors that only use water for agricultural use or utilities, and those can specify on the resilience level of that sector. And the goal of that was if you or your utility, or let's say your farm or your acequia or your community is resilient, that would overall help the other sectors within your climatic region to become more resilient also. So the goal was to look at it in a more in-depth view. If we can look at you know, an individual within a community, if they're resilient and you know the neighbors aren't, you know, they're doing their thing, and hopefully the point is to see where the I would say gap is or issues are that we can discuss how to maintain or improve that resiliency level. And so that was the main goal of kind of separating the sectors. Our goal is to gather the information when we set these up for the public input to assess and go through these measurements or criteria to look at, to not only to see to themselves of where the watershed health isn't resilient, or maybe agriculturally they're not resilient, or where they are, not just on a whole, but by, you know, by parameter of where the main vulnerabilities are, and then to start thinking about adaptation strategies for those issues and vulnerabilities. So that's kind of why we separate things. Everything does affect others, but the goal is to focus within where you can primarily focus on how of whether you are or aren't resilient on a level. Yeah. And that's kind of where we were going. So
okay. If I could just a quick follow-up on that.
Yeah.
Thank you both for your really thorough answers. I mean, if I were in your shoes, that's totally understandable. If I were in your shoes, I'd be doing the same thing, is going by sector, so that you get some the ability to focus and with like subject matter expertise and similar issues. But it might be interesting to have a cross-sector section as well, just to talk about, and maybe later in the process. That's just an idea. But coming back to your chart, I really like this chart. I wanted to say something about water sharing agreements, and I definitely appreciate that that's there. I think that's really important, and that it is an indicator of resilience. That I think it's important enough to add acequias as a very distinct type of water sharing, and if it gets to a point of collecting data, and you're collecting data from acequias, a really key factor in whether there is a shortage sharing agreement in place is whether there's a regional acequia association in existence in that basin. So a regional acequia association is an association of acequias that share the same stream system or in the basin, and that most of them originate from a separately administrated section of an adjudication. But really, in addition to adjudication defense, they've actually performed many other functions, and one of them is facilitating shortage sharing agreements. So they serve a similar sort of capacity as an irrigation district. So I know that you're limited in space, but when you're describing this in narrative form and you're talking about acequias, I think regional acequia associations are really important in determining whether acequias have the capacity to negotiate among themselves for shortage sharing, and also to negotiate with other parties such as pueblos or municipalities. So I just think that's a data point that should be added, and I think at least the word acequias should be added to the chart.
Thank you
for that input. Yeah, thank you. And go ahead, Amy.
So maybe I could have another conversation with you later, Paula. I have worked with some acequia, or one in particular that was actually physically fighting and not getting along, and we worked out a sharing agreement and it involved putting in flumes and having telemetry so that they could see how much water each person was diverting. It was based on the flow at a USGS gauge, and they could all, because prior to that, they thought their neighbor was taking a lot of water just by how it looked. But once we had the nerdy little spreadsheet and all the stream gauges or the ditch gauges in place, then they knew, okay, I see, they're taking what they're allowed to take. We're all sharing in this. So sometimes it's, I guess there's different levels of sharing agreements, but there wasn't a Safety Association, but they were all fighting, and they needed the structure for which to share and be ready to not fight when there was a problem. So.
Yeah, that's a great story. I mean, there's what, shortage sharing within acequias, and then there's shortage sharing between acequias, and then there's shortage sharing between groups of acequias and other parties. And so when we talk about shortage sharing, I think it's important to acknowledge the different layers of complexity. And yours is a really great example of resolving one, relatively small local dispute, and that's really important because people's water rights were at stake. But there's larger scale shortage sharing agreements also, and that we want to take into account.
Is there a list I was trying to find such a list of existing shortage sharing agreements?
Well, I don't think there's a comprehensive list, but we can share with you whatever data we have that has to do with regional. I mean, virtually every acequia has its own shortage sharing, whether it be by custom or something more complicated that involved outside intervention maybe. But as far as like basin-wide shortage sharing or stream, stream system level, we can share with you some information that we have, and it might be incomplete, but we'd be happy to share that.
Great.
I do. I thank you for your input, especially on that regional part with it, especially since, again, I think the overview of what we're looking is kind of at a larger scale too, not, as you saw, kind of some of the maps are more of a regional area of water usage. But that's something we can definitely take in on a note. Also with the cross-sector view, I think that the big piece we want to hit that on especially is once we start talking about adaptation strategies is showing these kind of cross-sector issues within a climatic region. Mm-hmm. Each kind of climatic region is going to be kind of affected slightly different based on where you are in the state in your climatic region based on elevation and location. So we definitely want to take that in. And if you have any input, we'll reach out to you, Paula, on that of how maybe you, how you would view of doing that cross-sector kind of view or assessment. So absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. I appreciate that.
Can I comment?
Yes, John.
First, again, it's you guys have the job of herding cats, and New Mexico, if you look at that map, we're a desert state, so we have high mountains and high plateaus, but the people, as you said, John, it's a matter of scale, looking at things. So there are vast areas of New Mexico. I noticed of one of the big areas is White Sands Missile Range. And it's a blank space because it was an area that really didn't have a lot of water to begin with. And so they were, it was selected a place to test missiles. And so New Mexico, one of our great economic benefits for this state are these vast empty spaces or places where we can store radioactive waste, or places they set that first atomic bomb off in July of 1946 5 in July because it was an empty space. They didn't think about the 4 downwinders over in Corona or Tularosa, but they set that bomb off. So that's one thing. And so Amy and all the Paula represents what I call the traditional people that go back to the Anasazi period when water ran out up in the high plateaus of northwestern New Mexico. The people moved to the valleys and concentrated along the Rio Chama and the Jemez, around the Jemez, and all the way down to the following the river all the way down to El Paso area. So it's when I got to New Mexico in '62, starting work for the Soil and Water Conservation Program, the state had about almost 1 million people. By 1980, it had 1,300,000. By 2000, it had 1,700,000, and now it's pushing 2 million. And when when we look at the decision makers in the state, the political power was in the rural districts. Now the political power is in the great urban districts, which produce a lot of water from urban runoff if we can keep it from getting polluted. But it's so hard to talk about a state where a lot of areas are still empty, but the people who live in those empty places love it, and they cherish it, and they take care of it to the best of their ability. But it's a real hard solution, and the key word is sharing. And we have to just convince a whole heck of a lot of the 2 million people who now live in this state what it means to share. They've never had to share. They flunk kindergarten sharing, a lot of them. And so it's kind of more of a social, geopolitical type of thing that we face in New Mexico. Who wants to be resilient when you can just go down to Costco? And so that's my say.
Thanks, John. We did get some questions sent in. Here is one. Are there data projections for changes in crop water demand due to higher temperatures? Amy, did we actually get any? I don't know if the Leap Ahead had anything like that.
We don't have that, but we could calculate that with the Blaney Criddle. I think we'll probably go through that exercise to see, does it increase 10%? Do a couple of examples in a few areas. If temperature goes up 2 degrees or 5 degrees, or the growing season increases by 6 weeks, how much more water demand that will be important.
Absolutely. Here's another one. It's a statement and a question. So I agree with Paula Garcia that a synthesis of resilience assessment results would be helpful. Higher resolution mapping of some of the resilience metrics would be helpful as well. Those are both great inputs, and we can look into some of that possibilities. And then finally, have you considered develop statewide and basin-specific supply and demand gap assessments? I believe
Oh, John, this is Hannah. I could jump in here
Okay.
on Patrick's question a little bit. Thanks, Patrick. So this 50-year water plan is not really intended to project or address directly supply-demand gaps. However, it is intended to tee up the potential for us to do that as part of the next update to the state water plan, which is due in 2023. But really, this 50-year water plan has a fairly limited scope, although it's very hard to limit it, which is to look at what are the impacts to our natural systems of projected changes in climate and how those might be, how are we vulnerable to those and where do we have resilience to those and what needs to be done to increase resilience throughout the state related to both these water use sectors, but also sort of the various climatic regions of the state. And so, and I don't know, maybe John, you want to chime in on that as well, but I think in terms of the basin specific supply demand gap assessments, I don't see that being a specific part of this particular initiative, but something that, you know, is needed and that might be something as part of a future effort. And then also maybe just to say on the earlier part of your statement there, responding to Paula, I think, you know, even though we're looking at these different sectors, we certainly are going to need to discuss in the report sort of the synthesis or the interaction of those vulnerabilities, because as we all know, water doesn't stick to any particular sector. So there will be discussion of that in the report for sure.
Yeah, I do believe, you know, the main goal of the 50-year water plan was to mainly focus, like you said, Hannah, on the kind of the level of resilience we are to these changes with the physical climate changing. We can point at the supply and demand piece from like 2018 state water plan and look forward to using the recommendations and the pieces that are from this for the next state water plan that will have a supply and demand gap assessment. There is another piece on which basins are the most water stressed already. That is technically, is that, do we have, I have found a map on that. I do know on a larger scale than just the state, but might not have that on here, do we, Amy?
No, you had it in your presentation yesterday.
Yeah.
The US.
Yeah, I did have a map of where we're currently water stressed, and majority of the state is under water stress by the climate in drought. It's something that's on the drought.gov. You can go to that website and we'll actually go to exactly the state. It is something that we have looked into though. So here's another question. Has any of this work considered interstate compacts? That is, Hannah, do you want to answer on that piece?
Sure. I mean, I think, again, this 50-year water plan is fairly constrained in terms of its scope, but certainly we will be commenting in that report about the potential for these anticipated changes to affect New Mexico's ability to comply with compacts and need for additional action to do so. So it will be addressed in the report.
Thank you. Here's one for you, Amy. Please describe the table under criteria 1. 2 ranges of surface water are shown. Is one of the ranges intended to be groundwater? I think that was just a typo on that table, Amy, under supply.
On this table that I'm showing right now?
The diversity of water supply portfolio. I think that's just a typo.
No, it is. If there's, it's all about surface water. So if there's 0% surface water, it's 100% groundwater. if it's 40 to 60% surface water, it's 40 to 60% groundwater. If it's 30% surface water, it's 70% groundwater. So I'm just showing the percentages of surface water in this table. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, it's whatever the percentage amount of surface water you have, you would have the other amount towards groundwater. That's what that piece is hitting on, correct?
Right.
I think, Amy, it's just that in each column you have SW, SW. Was it intended to be SW?
Yes,
GW?
it is intended to be SW.
Okay. Are there any other discussions or questions from anybody on the subject? If you are having problems unmuting yourself, feel free to kick a question to me so I could, because there have been a few that haven't been on it, having issues with unmuting themselves, I've noticed. So if not, if not, are there any last pieces that you want to hit on, Hannah or Amy?
I would just really encourage everyone who's participating today, and thank you so much for your time, to think more on what was presented and to send us any feedback that you might have. We really welcome that. And also just to put this in the bigger context, this month and next month, we're focusing on evaluating resilience and getting input from the public and various water use sectors on resilience. And then we'll be transitioning in October, late October, particularly around the the Water Resources Research Institute conference, annual conference in late October, into gathering input on adaptation strategies and other recommendations to address building additional resilience in New Mexico. And so getting all the smart people at the table to think about that and capturing your input is what we're looking to do, and we look forward to hearing from you.
We did get one final piece, actually. This is a comment just as input. It may help each of the areas had the calculation showing the resilience factors by regions so we can comment more thoroughly. By climatic region, or those regions. So on those maps, Amy, I think that's what he's hitting on.
So I'm not seeing the question showing up. So you want them to be analyzed by region. And I was thinking about bringing up that issue. Are these irrigated locales, assessing the irrigated locales of any value? Is one farm completely different from the neighboring farm that it makes no sense to lump them together within an irrigated locale? So maybe John, can you answer the question?
Well, I think that was one of the things too, is from the state agency, from Department of Ag, is hitting on a local, personal individual producer. How would you look at the resilience level of them with looking at, data at such a large scale? How do you hit on that to show that? I'm just looking into that comment. It may help each of the areas have the calcs showing the resilience factors by region so we can comment more through. I think that it
water planning region. Does it mean water planning region?
It might, we can always also show by the climatic region too. I don't see that would be a problem of showing on the maps.
We've been discussing quite a bit what is appropriate to report on. How do people feel about these assessments?
Mhm.
Would you rather just see the table and no scoring at all?
Mm-hmm. That is something that we've discussed, and it is something that for input. It is in the survey. Again, the survey on agricultural is on our website now. Any input we can get on or questions of even this sort on pieces that or suggestions that could go towards a possible assessment of resilience for irrigated agricultural. We even have a question on there about, on an individual level for, looking at that, how would you look at that? If possibility of showing on maps more scores, that is definitely something you can put in the input if that would help for the final assessment piece that we would present in October. Feel free to make that suggestion. That will really help us with also how to present the assessment to the public. So if there's any pieces that you think will help with understanding where somebody is on the resilience level would help, please give us that input also. That would be great. Amy, do you have any final things to say?
No, just to reiterate what you and Hannah said, please give us your comments. Thank you so much.
One comment, I think you should single out, discuss by river basin, like the Rio Grande system of basins is over a river running across alluvial aquifers. The Pecos is running across bedrock aquifers of various kinds with cavernous, mostly carbonate rocks. The San Juan is different. Each one of those, also Canadian, is different. Each one of those has their own compact, and I can't emphasize how important it is to explain to people what these compact limitations are. They're real. The Colorado River, the Rio Grande Compact, the Pecos, they're what's driving us right now. And there are forces outside the state. Hannah knows this. Anybody, Rolf Schmidt-Peterson knows this. We're relying on the kindness or the lack of kindness of others in this operation.
Thanks, John. Yep, Hannah.
I was just going to say thanks, John, for that. Very astute. We appreciate that, and that's so true.
All right. Thanks everybody for attending. I really appreciate your input. Thank you, Amy, for presenting today with your in-depth presentation. Again, feel free, jump on the 50-year water plan website. We have a survey on there for input on agricultural right now. Tomorrow, the public water system and domestic well one will open up. So that presentation starts at 3 p.m. tomorrow. So feel free to jump on tomorrow and attend that. And thank you everyone for attending. Again, please, the biggest piece we really need is input from the public, especially on finalizing these kind of assessment pieces. So feel free to give us your input, and it's all highly appreciated. And I will see everybody tomorrow. Thanks again, Amy, and thanks, Hannah, for helping out with the questions. We will see you guys tomorrow at 3 p.m.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.